Good morning and welcome to this morning's town hall meeting. My name is Rick. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Bkcase project, which is responsible for these two things here, which I'll talk about in a moment. My day job, I'm a systems engineering academic. I work in a university in the UK, systems engineering, education and other things. I'm going to get the boring background bit out of the way. At some point I have to assume that you know what Bkcase and SEBoK is, and I don't need to spend all the presentation going through those things. So this is my one background slide. Acronym soup, I'm afraid, but that's the way of the world these days. So Bkcase is the project. The body of knowledge and curriculum to advance systems engineering is the umbrella term for the whole thing. It's sponsored and supported by the IEEE Computer Society, INCOSE, and the Systems Engineering Research Centre. Bkcase currently has two products, the SEBoK and the Graduate Reference Curriculum, which we pronounce Gracie, both of which are managed by an editorial board, which I lead day to day, and that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. If you want to know some of the history and background, if you want to know who we are, what our current plans are, where we're going to be, or any of that kind of information, then bkcase.org is our website. And that's got all of the information you'll need to get oriented to the project and to find out what we're doing. There are a number of embedded videos on there, so slides with voiceover, which range from 2 minutes to about 10 minutes. Which basically cover this kind of presentation stuff. So if you want a quick view of what we are and what we're doing, very professionally narrated by Johnny Depp. It's amazing how cheap he was and how much he sounds like me when you get him on a microphone. But doesn't look like me, unfortunately, for him. So Bkcase website is where you can get all the stuff you need to know on the background. And because I've done this for 3 years now, I'm not going to go into any more background detail. I'm going to assume you all basically know what we are and what we're doing. And if you don't, you can go on the website and find out. I'll leave the vision on while I talk. So that's our goal. That's my pitch to the governors to keep supporting me, that we're trying to do these things for our sponsoring organizations and for systems engineering as a whole. What I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to give you a very quick report on the year's activities. What have we been doing? What's going on with the project, how is it being used, and then take any general questions people might have. Last year I did the basic overview and then left plenty of time for questions. This year I'm going to take a few questions if there are any, and then I'm going to spend the second half of the hour giving you a little bit of detail of some of the things we've got planned, because I think that there are some very interesting things coming up that you might like to know about in a little more detail. So I'll take a few questions if you've got any, and then I'm going to do the geeky bit, what's actually going on inside the body of knowledge. So what have we been up to in the last 12 months? Well, we've released 2 new versions of the SEBoK, which is our general practice. Version 1.4, which was very heavily tied in with the updates to the INCOSE handbook, the ISO standard, and some of the underlying key references of systems engineering. So 1.4 in many ways was a bit of a milestone, because it kind of completed a process that we started back in 2009 with the SEBoK and the handbook and the standard all affecting and influencing each other. And we've got to that stage now, and we want to move on from there. And I'll talk about that in the second part. Version 1.5 was released in December. Version 1.5.1 was released very shortly afterwards, because just after the deadline for publication, somebody got in touch and said there was a key reference in one of the articles that had changed. We decided its impact across the rest of the SEBoK was small, but its value in that article was important, and we didn't want to wait another 6 months, so we did a small update and put in that key reference. And I'll talk a little bit about the update process in a moment. We're not Wikipedia, but on the other hand, we want to be responsive and open and changing to reflect the body of knowledge. We've put in slightly modified update process in, which is probably only interesting to the editorial board, but we're going to publish our new versions at a slightly different time of year, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We're also looking at the graduate reference curriculum this year. In November 2015, we released version 1.1 of that, which was an update to reflect some of the changes to the SEBoK and just to review the document, to put in the new sponsors and organizations who are looking after it. This year, we are thinking of making a more substantial change to Gracie if we think it needs it, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. I'm going to talk about usage statistics and how the SEBoK is going, and I'm going to talk about plans for this year. And that's going to take up the majority of my time. So I want to break with tradition and start with Gracie. So Gracie is the graduate reference curriculum for systems engineering. It was the other half of the original Bkcase project. So we needed a body of knowledge to help us with the reference curriculum, and the sort of scope of a master's curriculum in systems engineering is one of the guiding principles for the scope and content of the SEBoK. It's aimed at that sort of audience as one of its possible uses. So there's always been a relationship between the SEBoK, that professional education, and its impact on professional practice, on the people who call themselves systems engineers. So that was the original aim of the reference curriculum. It is a reference, it's not a curriculum, it doesn't tell you what to teach or how to teach it in detail. It doesn't have courses and modules and syllabus, but it does give some general guidance on the parts of the body of knowledge that we might expect a master's curriculum to cover, how well they should cover it to some extent, and some other guidance and help on putting a master's program in a domain-independent systems engineering way together. And if you're interested in Gracie, you can have a look at it on the website. This time last year, we got together, and the original plan for the project, so SEBoK version 1 was released at the end of 2012, and Gracie version 1 very shortly afterwards. And we said that we wouldn't look at Gracie again until 2016, so we give it 3 years for the SEBoK to evolve and for Gracie to be used and for us to learn what we wanted from a reference curriculum. So this time last year, we started talking about where we might take Gracie next. And really, we came up with 3 broad conclusions, which we're going to continue to explore this year. The first is that we should gather some more information. So in 2009, we did a survey of existing programs. We talked to some academics involved in systems engineering, and that formed the input to the way we shaped and developed the curriculum, and indeed the body of knowledge. A lot's happened since then, so we want to find out what the current state of systems engineering programs is, and there's already been some work done by the CERC looking at that, so we can leverage that to some extent. We want to find out who's been using Gracie and how and what they've got from it. And we have some of that information, but we haven't done a sort of extensive survey to really baseline that information. And more generally, we want to figure out what our stakeholders want from reference curriculum, and indeed what our broader stakeholders want from systems engineering education, because we're focusing on that topic as part of the community now. Having done that, and that process has already started, but we'll be stepping that up in 2016, there are 3 things we could do maybe. One of them is to look at Gracie as it currently stands and to review it and update it. To look at the bits that are working well, to review the bits that people have questions about or are not using, to return to the original document and to review it and to consider updating it and changing it. And in particular, to look at how the SEBoK has evolved in the preceding 3 years and whether Gracie needs to reflect that. And I'll touch upon that a moment in the second half of my talk when I talk about where the SEBoK is going. So we could look at Gracie and we could review and update it, and we will. And how much we'll do depends on what we find. We've also, in the last 3 years, had conversations about curriculum guidance more generally. Would it be useful to have something in the Gracie style that described courses and modules we might use in general engineering education or in domain-specific master's programs, or indeed even in workforce development and in-house training? So is there a broader scope for curriculum guidance in this form, and could Gracie or something in the Gracie family form part of, take on some of that role? And indeed, Gracie was aimed at a community of people who want to do systems engineering education and want help doing it, and it's been very valuable for that. What we didn't set out to do was to make the case for why systems engineering was important, or how systems engineering could be extended and improved. And maybe that's something we should be looking at in our curriculum thinking, actually advocating. Now that we've got a mature body of knowledge, now that we've been using Gracie, is there more we can do in actually advocating the value of systems engineering education? And what's the role in that? So this afternoon in here, we will have a workshop to talk about the Gracie agenda and to do those, if you like, in-house things of reviewing and improving the curriculum guidance we already have, and to think about that broader agenda of systems engineering education and curriculum guidance in the round and where we might take that. So if you're interested in that and you can join us this afternoon, please do. If you're interested and you can't, please contact us via the website, and you can be part of that broader conversation. So that's Gracie. SEBoK is the other partner in the Bkcase project. SEBoK is our guide to the systems engineering body of knowledge. It's living in an authoritative, it describes the scope of the discipline, it gives some structure and guidance to the knowledge, and then it gives references to go and find the detailed knowledge. So it doesn't contain all the knowledge, but it's there to be the front door for how to find and use the knowledge, and that's the scope we intended for it. A little bit about SEBoK usage. Because we publish it as a wiki, and I'll talk about that in a moment, we can gather some useful and interesting statistics about how it's being used. Tantalizingly, not quite everything we'd like to know, but we can certainly get some useful insights into its use. So these are the January usage statistics. If you're interested in this stuff, and why wouldn't you be, it's on the Bkcase website. Those in the community get sent it, but if you're interested and want to know, you can go on the Bkcase website and find it and keep track of how we're doing. So we track the total visits and the unique visitors and the number of page views every month, and you can see the numbers there. These are January statistics, and we generated them a couple of days early so I could use them in this presentation. And because that, we are tantalizingly just under the 1 million total views. And I'm sure if I'd left this till Monday, we would have gone over the 1 million. So let's pretend we did, all right? Let's tell our friends that happened. Thank you very much. Spontaneous applause, that's what if you push hard enough, you can always get spontaneous applause, I find. So we've had 1 million page views over the 3 years that it's been live. We've had getting close to 500,000 unique visits, not 500,000 people, but a number of people have been back 500,000 times, which is good, I think. I don't know if the colours, there are 2 bars on there. I don't think the light blue colour comes out very well, but this is a comparison year on year. So this is January IW time since 2013 when we first started monitoring this stuff. And you can see that our numbers are going up by about 50–60%. So we're half as much again, plus a bit every year, and that trend is continuing. So the use is growing, and it's growing at a steady, comfortable rate, and we're happy with that growth and that continuing extension of the use of the SEBoK. Again, I'm afraid these slides don't necessarily come out well on the big screen. There are a couple of things we gather in statistics you might be interested in. So these are the countries that are from which the visitors are coming, and I'm sorry if you can't see this. These slides after this presentation will be on the Bkcase website. I don't know if they'll also be available on the symposium site, but certainly they'll be on the Bkcase website if you want to know this stuff. So about 30% of our visitors in January came from the US. About 10% from India and about 10% from the UK, and then 3 or 4% from a whole number of places. There are some interesting countries on here: Philippines, Brazil, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, as well as the usual suspects. So there's a broad community of people using the SEBoK. If January statistics are a reliable source, and going back over the months, this is the normal sort of profile that we tend to see. I've also pulled out, and again, not a great slide on the big screen, but it tells you the stats are there to go and look at. We look at the most popular pages being downloaded every month. So the usual suspects on here, the front page, the download page, the overview of systems engineering. The most popular articles in January were stakeholder requirements and system requirements, closely followed by models, life cycle, and also systems engineering and software engineering, systems engineering and project management. And those are typically the kinds of pages that get visited a lot. But there's a broad scope of people using a whole variety of things in the SEBoK, which is, again, is interesting, I think. This is the stuff I find interesting. What can I tell you? So, for those of you who've seen these presentations before or know anything at all about the SEBoK, it's organized into 7 parts, and those parts are intended to cover the scope and context of relevant systems engineering knowledge. Part 3, which is in the center, is the, if you like, the traditional life cycle and process knowledge. Parts 2 and 5 cover the foundational material, the systems, system science, underlying concepts, and the people, organization, enabling foundational knowledge. Parts 4 and 6 cover the application of systems engineering in different kinds of system and our relationship with other disciplines. And the knowledge, the things around the outside are a very quick and dirty attempt to describe some of the other areas of knowledge that systems engineering has to be conscious of and reaching into. Part 1 is an overview of the SEBoK as a whole and of systems engineering, and Part 7 are examples to illustrate the concepts in the SEBoK and also provide a resource for people doing teaching and other kinds of activities. The SEBoK is published as a wiki, so it's electronic, it's navigatable. That allows us to both have a navigatable structure and also to manage the update process, and to the mechanics of reviewing and changing it are quite neat. Those 7 parts are organized into knowledge areas, and knowledge areas are what they say. They're coherent areas of relevant knowledge. The knowledge areas are broken into articles. We took an editorial decision very early in the project to keep this structure simple and flat. So a knowledge area doesn't get bigger than something like 7 or 8 articles, and an article is limited in size and scope. So each of the knowledge areas and articles is a chunk of information that to some extent stands on its own and you might want to know about. The richness and complexity of the knowledge is in the way that the articles are linked and the way you navigate around them. So this doesn't go down to 7 or 8 levels of structure and detail. You can go down to that level of complexity in the way you navigate the structure and the relationships. And I think that was turned out to be a great decision in terms of the way the SEBoK it's given us and the way it's allowed us to both change it and to manage that change. Within a particular article, we limit the size of the text. So if you can't say it in 2,000 words, you need 2 articles, and you need to think about how that topic logically splits into foundations and detail, or usual case and extended, or whatever it is, so that you can present it logically in that way. Along with that text, we obviously have diagrams as appropriate. We have links to other articles so that you can follow. So if you're reading the article on requirements and you want to know a little bit about emergence or about stakeholders and stakeholder engagement, you can jump to that article and read it now, or you can wait and read it later, or you can say, I already know that. So we've got that way to navigate around the knowledge within the body of knowledge. We have links out to wider references, which is where the detailed knowledge lies. Those references have to be publicly available. They don't necessarily have to be free, but everybody has to be able to get them and read them if they want to. And more, these kind of sources are freely available, but that's the way we organize this. There are primary references that are like what should you read first? What's the authoritative sources to push us in that direction? The interesting thing, and I'll come back to this in the second half, is that where there aren't authoritative references for a topic, that's a challenge for INCOSE and INCOSE working groups. And for example, the requirements working group, as you heard yesterday, have produced a definitive authoritative guide to writing requirements, because while there's lots of great requirement stuff, there wasn't really a definitive source. So that has been a way of engaging with the working groups to make that connection. There's also a glossary of terms that are used across the SEBoK. Those are defined from a relevant source, and because someone will ask, because someone always does, we don't necessarily choose the one definitive definition of a term. If there is an agreed, obvious definition, we do. If in the actual body of knowledge that's out there, there's more than one definition and there's some richness and overlapping complexity in how the community thinks about a term, we may produce 2 or 3 definitions and a brief discussion of that richness. So if the body of knowledge genuinely has some overlap or conversation about a term, we can represent that. And again, that's become a challenge to some of the working groups. The article on complexity, there wasn't, certainly we couldn't find the definitive community-agreed definition of complexity, so we've put a number of them in there. The Complex Systems Working Group has been working on a product which is attempting to do just that. So if that becomes accepted and agreed, we can make that move. So there's a to and fro between the SEBoK and the community, which I think has been one of the delights of doing this job, that it's actually not just a place to put knowledge, its existence stimulates discussion about knowledge. Okay, here's the geeky stuff, one of the geeky bits. We've slightly changed our publishing process to align better with the meeting cycle and the way we do things in the year. So the inner circle of this diagram at 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock are the 2 big INCOSE events of the year, this one and the symposium. They're the obvious places to synchronize getting people together and making decisions. We will now publish in March and September to kind of spread the publishing out between those. So at this meeting, we're doing 2 things. We are reviewing and finalizing new material that we started talking about last July with the intent of publishing it in March as the next update of the SEBoK. We are also beginning to talk now about proposals to be discussed, authored, reviewed, to be published this September. And we will be talking about those in detail at the International Symposium in July. And we'll also be talking about plans in July for next March. So we have these 2 overlapping offset cycles to allow us to manage and synchronize new material as we go along through the year. And if you want to know more about that, there is detail on the website. So at that point, I'd like to take any sort of general questions about the SEBoK, its existence, the way we manage it, for a couple of minutes, if there are any. And then I'd like to move on and give you some detail of some of the things we're doing to actually work within the SEBoK. But before I do that, are there any questions on the general scope of this thing and what we're doing with it? If you'd like to step up to the microphone. I'll take these 2, and then that should give us a starting point, and then I'll move on to the detail if appropriate.
Thank you. I noticed that both the Gracie and the SEBoK include V&V as an activity.
Yes.
But when I look at the program plan you described, I cannot find any effort that V&V's Gracie itself or the SEBoK itself. How are you going to measure the effectiveness of the graduates of a program, and how are you going to measure the utility of the SEBoK to our 10,000 members?
Okay, well, the utility of the SEBoK is done through the engagement that we have here and through the continual review. So many of the working groups responsible for areas of content, part of their plan is to review, help us improve, and look at the utility of the SEBoK. So the test of the value of the SEBoK is in its use, and because we are continuing review and updating it, that allows us to evolve towards something which is more and more valuable and useful. The question about measuring the utility of both Gracie and the graduate and the programs that it sponsors is a very good one. And that's one of the things we want to talk about this year. So the value of Gracie we can do through engagement with the community. The value of systems engineering education is a very interesting question which INCOSE is thinking about as a broader topic. So that's the approach that we're taking to manage those things. It is by its nature a more agile life cycle view than we might have said, let's set some some properties and measures and requirements and let's measure against them. It's more of a continual evolution. The value is when it's good, we use it, and when it's not good, we change it. And hopefully we've got that balance right between being somewhat rigorous and evolving forward. But certainly the other question about education is a very good one. We'll take the other question.
You showed the publication and update cycle, and I was wondering, do you have like a call for proposed topics? Like you've decided, we want to add this topic, and you put out a call, or are you just looking for people to say, oh, I looked through it and I didn't see this topic, I'd like to provide that content?
Both. So, and there is a separate presentation on that, which I've given at previous versions of this town hall, and I've chosen today to focus my second part on some of the details of the content. But there is a facility within the SEBoK for anybody to embed comments and questions directly, which the editorial team reviews. We also engage with the working groups so that a lot of the proposals for change come through the working groups. And through the website, anybody can contact us and find out what's going on. So if you have either a detailed suggestion or a broader discussion, you can do that individually. If you think there's an area we should be dealing with, you can either do that individually, or you can engage with the working group and encourage the working group to engage with us. And all of those mechanisms are working, and are working very well. And I think it's our job to encourage those. And I think that goes to the other question. The better the SEBoK is, the more it pulls along the community to want to use it and make it even better. And I think that's part of our dynamic and our activity. I'll take another question if there is one, but if not, I can go on to talk about what we're actually planning to do with the SEBoK in the next 12 months. Does anybody else have a question before I do that? Okay, thank you very much. As it says on here, on Monday morning, we have an open Bkcase session where some of the members of the editorial board will be there to answer any questions. So if you want to know more, if you'd like to come along and ask, there's time on Monday morning to do that. Tuesday morning is our closed planning session, but I know a lot of the working groups have similar planning sessions on Tuesday morning. So if you're in a working group on Tuesday morning and you're saying, maybe we should do something with the SEBoK this time, but we're not quite sure, come and find us. The room we're in is on the program, and we'll engage with other working groups during that morning session while we're doing our detailed planning. So there are two opportunities this week to find us and ask more questions. Of course, you can just stop me in the corridor and offer me a biscuit, and I'll be more than happy to help. And we'll see how that goes. And of course, you can engage through the website and the SEBoK in the normal way. So if there aren't any other immediate questions, I will go on to the second part of my presentation and give you some of the detail of, if you like, the new things that are coming along, and particularly with an IW flavour, the new things that have been inspired by our interaction with the community. And I think there are a couple of, talk about biscuits, one of our English phrases is that something takes the biscuit, by which we mean it's awesome, all right? We can't do awesome because that sounds a bit enthusiastic, so, but you're allowed to take a biscuit. So I think some of the things in the second part of this presentation genuinely take the biscuit, all right? And that's about as enthusiastic as I'm ever going to be. They freaking take the biscuit, all right? No, I'm sorry, that just felt uncomfortable. Some of the things in here are actually not terrible. All right, that's fine. I like that better. All right, so I put this slide up last year and said there's lots of stuff going on. I don't have time to tell you about it. Go and look on the website. This year, I'm going to tell you about some of it. So some of the things we're doing to actually take the content forward. I'll mention this one briefly because it's been really one of the significant achievements of the SEBoK. Version 1.4, I said, and 1.5 to some extent, focused a lot on part 3, which is the life cycle and process part of the SEBoK. It's the thing that looks a bit like the INCOSE handbook, 15288. It describes the core things that systems engineers do in a project or program. And we've put a lot of work into aligning that with the changes that were going on in the handbook, in the relevant international standards, and in that part of systems engineering. I'm indebted to Gary Brodler for this diagram. It's good that I've got this because I suspect Gary's going to be quite busy for the next couple of years. But Gary has been one of the leaders in helping us to do this. And this diagram describes a co-evolution between the SEBoK, the standard, and the handbook. So a lot of the actual work in thinking about life cycle and process and generically what systems engineering really means in a modern, agile, model-based way, which forms the basis for it becoming more useful in a variety of applications and places in the world, was done in the SEBoK and then has been reflected in the handbook and the standard. And we've been not just a recipient of that knowledge, but one of the key players in evolving that. I apologize if not all the text shows up great on the screen here. Again, if you want to know about this stuff, then you can have a look at this slide on the website. It looks great on my screen, but the colors don't necessarily work on that screen. Apologies for that. Okay? That's really last year's news and a significant achievement. What are we doing? What have we done for you lately? Well, three things I want to talk about. One of them is model-based systems engineering. So this time last year, we had a meeting with the then AD for the transformation, the people from the MBSE working group and members of the editorial board to talk about how we reflect the MBSE transformation in the SEBoK. SEBoK 2012 describes the state of systems engineering, which there are models used throughout the whole of systems engineering, but the move towards a model-based discipline with formalized shared models in key places in the project is only touched upon. And now that systems engineering is making that transformation, we want the SEBoK to reflect that thinking. So we talked about what we can do to make the SEBoK more model-based and to reflect the transformation that's going on. And not surprisingly, we identified aspects of modeling and model-based that were applicable to each of the SEBoK parts and the detailed knowledge areas. And we started to talk about a strategy for getting there from here, which overlapped with the transformation strategy. We identified two key things we could do easily. One of them was to create an article in part one of the SEBoK that talks about what MBSE means, what the transformation means, how it will affect the SEBoK and how it will affect systems engineering. And the other is to put a case study on MBSE transformation into part 7 to begin to illustrate how MBSE is working. And then to start working on the other things, detailed MBSE related concept to go in the other parts of the SEBoK to reflect how the transformation is happening. We met yesterday to talk about that, and those two things have been achieved, and they will be in the next 2 issues of the SEBoK, and we have a good, solid agenda for taking the next parts forward. Very briefly, thank you very much to Steve Mitchell, who's here somewhere, and to our colleagues both at Lockheed Martin and in the MBSE working group for giving us a very interesting case study. So the SWIFTS project is a submarine project which has transitioned from being one of those big bespoke once-in-a-generation development, sort of onboard systems developments, to being a federated architecture where new equipment, new onboard equipment is inserted every year and the capability continues to grow and evolve. In order to achieve that transformation, they transformed the project from document-based to model-based, and that's allowed them to have a rapid insertion and improvement of the capability, but with a diminishing cost and time. So it's a very successful MBSE application. The case study focuses not on the modeling, but on the MBSE transformation and the value of that. It's also interesting because it's an implementation of MBSE fairly late in the life of a project. This is not starting in a model-based way. This is taking a very complex document-based project and putting in the effort to make it model-based so it can go forward into the future. And I think that makes it a very interesting case study for the SEBoK. So you can look forward to seeing that in September. This is a more detailed version, and you can't read the detail on this, but that's fine, of the areas of the SEBoK that we think model-based thinking has some applicability to. And when you look at those and think about how across the body of knowledge can we bring in modeling and model-based, it makes you ask some broader questions about why we want to do modeling and what kind of models we want to do. what should we model in detail and what kind of modeling languages should we use to do it, who does that work and what skills and competencies do they need to do that, and when in the life of a system should that modeling be done, and how does it relate to the other disciplines we work with and to providing value to systems as a whole. And that sort of dialogue is part of our two-way discussion with the MBSE working group. I don't know about you, but my personal opinion of model-based is that the what to model and how to model it is very good and getting better and better. The why are we modeling and can we explain it to everybody, and what skills do we need, and how does it fit with other disciplines, and how do we make it all hang together and work side of it is where we need to sort of have some focus and activity. And the SEBoK and the working group are talking about some of those things. Here's my first takes the biscuit moment. So the object modeling group and INCOSE and a couple of other organizations are looking at SysML version 2. So the system modeling language we've got was developed a number of years ago. It focuses on core products, dividing and modeling the system. What should the next generation of system modeling language look like? Well, what the project have done is to create a model, systems engineering concept model, which describes the things that we need to know and understand and manipulate to do systems engineering. And that model has been produced by taking the SEBoK and some of the related products and creating a conceptual model of what are the things the SEBoK talks about, how are they related to each other, and at some level of abstraction, what is the knowledge needed to do good systems engineering. That model builds on modeling work that was done by the original Bkcase team in order to create the SEBoK, but takes it to the next level. The detail of how that model is then used to create a detailed description of the knowledge which can be used to identify which parts of that knowledge SysML needs to cover is not for us today, but the complexity and the sort of extent of that gives you some idea of the role that SEBoK is playing in helping to create the future modeling language. And I think that certainly takes a couple of biscuits. What's interesting for us is to work with the concept modeling team to validate that reference model. Does it actually say, they've produced this independently, so people from the modeling community have modeled the current SEBoK, version 1.5 of the SEBoK, and produced what the modeling says are the concepts and relationships. So the Bkcase editorial board will review that with them and validate that that model actually describes the SEBoK and that it's what we want to say. And we're going to do that in the next 12 months. Having done that, the models will be extremely useful for us to drive our editing process. So your question about how do we know what should be in the SEBoK and what's good, well, part of the answer will be driven by those models and the relationships between them and what they say about the knowledge of systems engineering. So we'll certainly use those models to drive our process. We're also strongly considering which of those models we might insert in the SEBoK, both to give, because a good model, a good diagram is really useful for describing and connecting together complex concepts. So those sorts of models might be exactly what we need in the SEBoK to guide the knowledge. Subtly and more interestingly, we will expect in the future systems engineers to be using models to describe complex ideas, to share them between them, to guide and constrain their ongoing activities. So putting these kind of models in the SEBoK is part of the transformation of systems engineering to a model-based discipline. And if you can't use those kind of models, then you won't be doing systems engineering. And that's going to be one of the ongoing activities. Now, because we don't want to say that now, but we want to say that at some point in the future. So the extent to which some of these models find their way into the SEBoK is, again, I think, going to be one of our interesting evolutions going forward. And we're going to start that process in the next 12 months. How does that go? It's not too bad on the screen. So this is one of the high-level models they've produced. This describes a breadth of concepts at a high level of abstraction. So systems, process and outcomes, disciplines and relationships, enterprise and organization and competency on one view. And that's the kind of way that the SEBoK covers the breadth of that knowledge. There are detailed diagrams in them. They've produced about 25 models, which go into the level of detail below that and talk about relationship between processors and break down competencies and talk about systems in more detail. And so we'll be looking at those models to see how they help us to take the SEBoK forward. And I think this is, a particularly exciting part of the work going forward. I'm certainly too keen to be more involved in this. It also helps us with our second question, which is the foundational knowledge. We made, again, an editorial decision in the original Bkcase project that we would cover systems foundations and we would cover knowledge about people and competencies and organizations and teams as part of our body of knowledge. It's not just about process and outcomes. It's about fundamental knowledge and concepts, and it's about how you create the environment to do good systems engineering. And we have two very good parts with some really interesting information in them. But it would be fair to say that's an area of our discipline which is not as mature as our understanding of how to do requirements. And the SEBoK helps us understand that. So how do we take that knowledge forward and reflect it in our body of knowledge is one of our challenges. You may know, and I don't know if everybody does, David Long mentioned this yesterday. There was a workshop early last year, organized by the NSF, which started a discussion about the theory of systems engineering. Do we have a theory? Do we know what it is? And if not, how do we get one? And this picture represents the outcome of the workshop. They threw a lot of theories up in the air. They put them on a board and put bits of string between them and reached, first of all, the conclusion that we don't currently have a coherent theory, but also the conclusion that it should be possible to create one if we think about where we are and where we want to go. And a number of ideas were put forward for the current theories which could form the elements of a theory of systems engineering and the concepts that make that possible. And again, you can't read those on the screen, but there's lots of knowledge out there. It's how we make it coherent. And that work continues to go on. And to the extent that that work produces a theory of systems engineering, you can expect to see it in the SEBoK. What we can do in the SEBoK is a little bit different and something which can help maybe add to that agenda. So there's currently work going on between INCOSE and the ISSS, the International Society for Systems Research, talking about something called systems literacy. And in a nutshell, and I'll get this wrong, but if you want to know the definitive answer to this, go and talk to them. But what are the foundational things about systems that we want everybody to know? Systems engineers, managers, customers, what are the foundational set of ideas about looking at the world in a systems way that we would like everybody to have, their literacy, their underlying knowledge, which we can then build systems engineering practice on top of? And can we organize and present that knowledge in a way which can be used in education from school up to and including university and indeed current practitioners to raise the level of that literacy to make all of our jobs easier? And the outcomes of that work will certainly find their way into the SEBoK. While there isn't a single underlying theory of systems engineering, and you can tell me whether there ever will be one, but exploring and looking for it, I think, is going to be an interesting journey. What we can do in the SEBoK is to create a guide to the current foundational theories. What is out there? How is it connected? How does that set of underlying theories begin to form some baseline for systems engineering? That's what the SEBoK is about. It's not trying to claim we have a theory, but it's organizing and structuring and presenting what we know of current theory, which could be the starting point for growing. And also, some of those theories will help systems engineers now. So we will begin the process in part 2 of bringing together those underlying theories from a whole range of sciences, system sciences and social and cognitive sciences, design and mathematics and organizational sciences. I compromised. I spelled organization with an S, but I did leave the S off the end of math. So I felt that I was kind of, somewhere in the middle. And we will start to do that, both for the value of the SEBoK, but also, hopefully, for something that the theory of systems engineering community might find interesting. And we will begin to use it, and this is where it links to the concept modeling, to improve the conceptual foundation, the integration, the consistency of the ideas presented in the body of knowledge. And that will be valuable to us. It may also start to help in the discussion of, does this somehow move us towards a theory? And what might that look like? But that's not my end goal. My end goal is to do this to support that. In the same way that my end goal isn't to achieve model-based systems engineering, but it is to represent it in the SEBoK in a way which helps that agenda. So this is another thing we'll be doing. If either of these things sound interesting to you, come along and talk to us and come and get involved, because that's the purpose of this activity, either through the System Science Working Group or through the MBSE Working Group or directly. And we'd be delighted to hear from anybody who wants to have that conversation. The third thing that I want to mention in terms of the new ideas for the SEBoK, if you like, the direction the SEBoK is beginning to move in is domain-specific systems engineering. So third big editorial choice at the beginning of the project was that we were talking about domain-independent systems engineering. We were talking about the generic processes and knowledge and ideas that underpin all systems engineering. And with the exception of part 7, which brings in case studies which have a domain-specific flavor, and I guess with the exception of the fact that the actual knowledge base of systems engineering comes from some domains and therefore reflects some of those domains more than others, which again has been one of our talking points, currently SEBoK is domain independent and valuable for that purpose. We want to begin to, alongside evolving that, actually start to move into representing some of the domains that are now a big part of INCOSE. So we're starting to think about how we bring domain-specific knowledge in, what value it has to the domains, and what value it has to the SEBoK. And we've done the same sort of activity as we did for model-based. Where across the SEBoK might domain-specific knowledge have value, and how do we bring it in? I mean, just briefly talk about our current thinking on this, and I'm actually, after this presentation and a cup of coffee, going to talk to some of the domain-specific people about where we're going with this. So this is one of the hot topics of this year's IW. So we're currently talking about domain examples. So case studies which illustrate how what's in the SEBoK is currently applied in a domain. And we can do that now because that's part of the SEBoK structure. But what we want, and we've got a whole range of case studies in the SEBoK, and they cover transport and space and IT and mail delivery, and that's post, not the other kind of mail, and a whole lot of other things. But we want some of those to come from the domain communities and reflect what they think their key strengths and issues and concerns are. The second thing we can do is to put domain overview articles in. So an article on systems engineering in healthcare, which is aimed at the rest of the systems engineering community. So what do we want all systems engineers to know about the strengths and weaknesses and values of systems engineering in healthcare? The third thing we can do is to put domain knowledge areas in, where we put in articles that take the next level of detail and are there for the healthcare community or the transport community or the oil and gas community. So articles that describe how systems engineering is done in a domain in a way which will be valuable to the domain. And the fourth thing we can do is to take aspects of that content and insert it in the current articles. So if there's a particularly insightful way that oil and gas interact with their stakeholders, which would be valuable to describe in the Part 3 requirements article, and that there's a really good reference we can give, we want to represent that knowledge in the SEBoK generally, so that we begin to follow the evolution of requirements, not just being about the way it's done in our traditional domains, but to have that flavour of how requirements is done in some of these other domains that move us in those directions. So we're aiming to start to create knowledge in those areas with the working groups, and I've used the example of healthcare because the healthcare working group is one of the first groups to take the step of start to try and doing this, and so we have some content from them in a couple of these areas, which again you will begin to see in September onwards, I suspect, maybe March, if there's something we think we can get in that we've already done some work on. So that's the discussion with the domains. The last thing I want to say on this, in terms of why we're at the IW and why we're engaging with you guys is quite rightly and not surprisingly because they're systems engineers, and I love systems engineers, but I wouldn't let my daughter marry one, is what's in this for us? Why should we spend our valuable volunteer working group effort writing articles to go in the SEBoK? Why can't we spend that time doing other things? So what value does a working group get, either a domain-specific working group or indeed the requirements working group or the natural systems working group or the architectures working group, in putting their effort into creating content for the SEBoK rather than somewhere else? Well, two things. And again, I apologize, this is a slightly wordy slide. We believe that the structure of the SEBoK and the idea of the SEBoK and the way it presents information, connects it with the rest of systems engineering, makes it available to everybody, writes it at this overview level is valuable for the working groups. So creating short descriptions which link into the rest of the knowledge, linking that to your definitive sources in your area, looking at, if appropriate, discussions of the viewpoints and different ways that some things are seen, and is that a good thing or a bad thing, creating a new synthesis and perspective on existing knowledge, but not directly generating new knowledge, is a valuable thing to do for the evolution of the discipline. And that doing it in that way actually is good for the working group as well as good for the SEBoK. With the domain-specific areas, the conversation goes, that's all great, but actually, unlike some of the more mature areas or the areas that have been doing this for longer, our definitive sources, our existing knowledge isn't published. It's in company documents. It's in domain-specific places. It isn't openly available to everybody. It's not mature enough, or indeed it doesn't exist, except in case studies and people's brains. So in that case, the conversation with the working group is create that knowledge outside of the SEBoK, create it in things like the Guide to Writing Requirements, like the Product Line Guide, like the Lean Enablers, but do it in parallel with also having those products connected in and visible in the SEBoK, because again, we think you'll get more value from that than just writing them standalone and making them available within the working group. So we're encouraging, or working with, or talking to the working groups about putting stuff in the SEBoK, but also creating material outside of the SEBoK in a way which serves both purposes. And that conversation seems to be working with the working groups. And if I can sell it to systems engineers, I can sell it to anybody. So again, we'll be doing more of that over the next 12 months. I'm not doing bad for time, which is surprising. All right, so this is traditionally how I end these town hall talks. What's our plan for the next 12 months? Well, version 1.6 of the SEBoK in March will be largely a maintenance update. So the cycle of these things tends to be articles get regularly reviewed, and if there's new ideas, if something new has been published, if there's a better way of describing something, if references have changed, that gets evolved and improved in the SEBoK. And that's part of our verification and validation exercise. So we'll be continuing to do that. We will start to put some of the MBSE information that we've been working on for the last 12 months in. We may start to put some of the domain-specific stuff in if we feel it's mature enough to go in for March. If not, it's definitely in line to go in September. Version 1.7 will be one of those updates of the SEBoK where there's actually something new in terms of the kinds of knowledge. So we will there start to see some of the new MBSE stuff. We will start to see some of the domain-specific stuff, and we will begin to change and reorganize and structure what we've got in the foundations areas. So these things tend to go in terms of maintenance updates or evolutions or a mixture of the two. So that will be happening over the next 12 months. In parallel with that, the Gracie conversation will be happening, and that continues this afternoon for those of you who are interested. We will be reaching out to the community and finding out about Gracie and about education, and we'll be reviewing and planning, and we will have firm proposals for Gracie changes for the INCOSE symposium in July, and conversations about the broader education agenda in the same time frame. Where that takes us, I suspect that there's a curriculum working group somewhere in this that goes beyond just the value of Gracie and looks at the idea of education and curriculum. And that's something we might end up doing, as long as somebody else wants to volunteer to run it. Plans for outreach continue, so we will be presenting at a whole range of other conferences. We will be presenting at the IEEE, at CSER, at the Industrial Engineering Conference. We're presenting some curriculum-related stuff at the ABEC conference. Despite my best efforts to fight this off, we will be following the trend of moving into social media. So there will be a hashtag, and there's nothing I can do about that. So the newsletter, which continues, and if you haven't signed up for the Bkcase newsletter, please do. Go on the website, say yes, and you'll get a monthly-ish newsletter telling you what we're doing. But there will be some other, modern, exciting stuff as well. So that's the website. I have one more slide, okay? So, no spoilers in this, all right? The franchise will definitely continue. But like J.J. Abrams, I am aware that while it's good to keep bringing back the old characters, at some point we're going to have to kill some of us off and actually, I've probably got one more movie in me, I guess. But at some point we need the new characters to keep this going. So we need people to come and get involved and help us take this thing forward. And I hope some of you will think that that might be a fun thing to do. So thank you very much. I guess we've got a couple of minutes, so I can take any questions. We don't really have much time, but are there any questions that anybody would like to raise to finish things off? I asked that in a way that really encouraged you to interact. All right. I've used up all the time. There is plenty of opportunity to ask us questions later. All right. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you.